Okay, so I just want to give a little bit before we even do the parsha in a nutshell. I want to give a little sort of a 2-second introduction, and that is that this week's parsha, you have a lot of ideas that the Torah discusses regarding the government in Israel. In other words, much of the Torah tells you about how to become a better person, how to serve God, how to live a moral life. But there's not so much about how the community, how the people of Israel should set up their systems of government once they settle in the land of Israel and once they're supposed to set up a government. Only in the 5th book, when it's just a few days before Moshe passes away, a matter of weeks. Moses is going to pass away within a matter of weeks. And Moses and the Jewish people are going to go into the land of Israel, cross over the Jordan into the land of Israel within a matter of weeks. That's the point where Moshe starts talking about what is the country, what is the government that we're going to set up? What is it going to look like? Right? Because there could be all different options for government. Even in the history of Israel, living in Israel, there were multiple different forms of government. Or in other words, forms of government, I would say. So what's the appropriate model of leadership when you talk about the Jewish people in the land of Israel? And again, it was not addressed in the first 4 books. It's only addressed in the middle of the 5th book in this week's parsha. And that is sort of the overarching theme of this parsha. Of course, there are many, many details, and you could take this in many directions, but that is one way to think about it. And you're going to see when you read this parsha that there's all different forms of leadership. We start with the judge. We go to the Supreme Court. We talk about the prophet. We talk about the priest. We talk about the king. All in this parsha. Okay? So think about it sort of as the separation of powers. There's not one ultimate form of leadership. We have a mix of different options. And sometimes the king is more dominant, sometimes the judge is more dominant, depending on what period of history. And again, there's so much to discuss because this is an absolutely fascinating topic. But that's the sort of the overarching idea. If you want a common theme, and it's not just institutions of government, it's also scenarios that come up when you're dealing with government. So for example, the end of this parsha, you have the portions and the description and the laws of warfare. Why not? Why in this parsha? Oh, if you have a king, you have a battle. If you have a king, you have an army. If you have an army, this is already not an individual person. The first 4 books is more individually, how do I interact with God? How do I interact with my fellow people? How do I interact with my own morality? That's the first 4 books of the Torah. The 5th book, we're about to go into Israel. We're going to build a country. We're going to build a country. We're going to build a state. There's going to be war. Okay, so how do I conduct myself in warfare? Okay, so that's also included. So you see what I'm saying? The overarching picture is government. How do we govern? How do we organize the community and society? So that's sort of the overarching idea of the parsha. So that's the introduction to the introduction. Now we do the introduction. Now we do the parsha in a nutshell, as is our custom. So I'm going to read it. I didn't print it out. I'm saving paper. It's getting so hot. I want to make sure that we save paper. It doesn't get any hotter. It's hot enough. Well, the parsha, that's a good question. And I think we're using the other one shelf lower. The stone one, that's a little easier, so we're on the same page. Not just figuratively, but also literally. Parsha of Shoftim. Shoftim is on page 1025 in the stone, but I'm not 1025, but I'm not reading from the book yet. Right now I'm reading from the screen. I'm reading in a nutshell. So if you're here, you could just listen, and I'm going to try to read this. So here we have Shoftim is the name of the parasha. Shoftim, if I can get there, yeah. Shoftim in a nutshell. Shoftim literally means judges, plural for judge. Judges is Shoftim. And the opening statement of the parsha, Moses instructs the people of Israel to appoint judges and law enforcement officers in every city. Literally, judges and officers shall you appoint in all your cities. B'chol sharecha, literally all your gates. All your gates means in all your cities. And this is a very famous verse that I read that the late Justice Ginsburg had this on her desk. I don't know if you knew that. Justice, justice shall you pursue. That's this week's parsha. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue. If you're in the law business, this is a good verse for you. Moses commands them, and you must administer it without corruption or favoritism. Crimes must be meticulously investigated and evidence thoroughly examined. A minimum of 2 credible witnesses is required for conviction and punishment. As you will see, that every two witnesses, as you will see as we go through this, almost every form of power has limitations. The king is going to have limitations. The prophet has limitations. The judges have limitations. What's the judge's limitation? The judge can't get up and say, I think this person is guilty. You need 2 credible witnesses, 2, right? So if you think about it, that's a very big restriction on the power of the judge, because there is, what's the word I'm looking for? There is, not regulation, but there's the laws that the judge must follow. And a very important check on the power of the judge, today we have the jury, but even the jury, the fact that that the laws of evidence is that you need to have 2 credible witnesses makes it very hard to convict somebody, okay? So you can look at it as, oh, it's very hard to be a prosecutor under this system. Correct, but you can also look at it, we're here to put a very important check on the power of the judge. The judge is not all powerful, just like the king is not all powerful. Every branch of government, so to speak, has some limitation. Okay, in any case, next paragraph. In every generation, says Moses, there will be those entrusted with the task of interpreting and applying the laws of the Torah. According to the law that they will teach you and the judgment that they will instruct you, you shall do. You shall not turn away from the thing that they say to you, to the right nor to the left. This is the mitzvah of listening to the Supreme Court. If you're a great sage, if you're a great rabbi, but you're in the minority, and the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, ruled about a certain question, you have to accept the ruling of the Supreme Court. If you don't, it's a capital crime. Why? Because then the Torah it will fall apart. Today we understand that because of the, I don't want to get into the history, because of the weakening of the institution of the Jewish Supreme Court, the Jewish law is full of arguments, and everything is debates. And the Mishnah has a debate on every paragraph. There are debates, but that's not the desired. That's not the desired scenario. The desired scenario, when there was a strong Sanhedrin of the Jewish Supreme Court, there were no debates. If you had a question, you go to Jerusalem. That's what the Torah describes in this parsha. You go to Jerusalem, and they take a vote, and they'll rule. And whatever they say, that stands. So the whole institution of the Jewish culture of Mishnah, of Talmud, of debates, is only because we no longer have a central Sanhedrin, Supreme Court. So that's interesting. In any case, next paragraph. Shoftim also includes the prohibitions against idolatry and sorcery, laws governing the appointment and behavior of a king, and guidelines for the creation of cities of refuge for the inadvertent murderer, which we discussed also a few portions ago, and we spent some time on that. Also set forth are many of the rules of war, the exemption of battle for one who has just built a home, planted a vineyard, married, or is afraid and soft-hearted. So there was a draft, but if you just built a home, they would send you home to enjoy your home, because it doesn't help if you're on the battlefield thinking about your new home. You're just not only not going to help the war effort, you're going to pull everybody else down. If you just married and you're thinking about your wife, not a good place to be on the battlefield. You're a distraction. Even if you planted a vineyard, these are the values: home, vineyard, and first married, you go home. The requirement to offer terms of peace before attacking the city, and the prohibition against wanton destruction of something of value, exemplified by the law that forbids to cut down a fruit tree when laying siege. Again, even we're talking about the institutions of government and the policies of the government, such as war, which is something that the government does. Again, there are limitations on your power to wage war, right? What happened in the Civil War? Was it many places? Those are the March to the Sea. What was the understanding of the Northern Army? If you want to win the war, you have to do what? You have to destroy the South, right? You have to destroy, because if you don't destroy and then rebuild, if you don't destroy, there's always going to be a threat. What does the Torah say? You're going to war, wonderful, you're allowed to go to war, but you have a limit on your power to wage war. What is the limit? An example of the limit is you cannot chop down a fruit tree. In war, you're killing people. Okay, you have to kill people. Sometimes you need to kill people, but that's not a blank check for destruction. Okay, so again, limiting the power of the king, limiting the power of the judge, limiting the power of the people and the government to wage war. Very interesting. In this context, the Torah makes the famous statement, "For man is the tree of the field." Right, there says, makes that connection, and therefore we respect human life, but we'll also respect life of all creations, including trees, and especially fruit-bearing trees. The parsha concludes with the law of the Egla Arufa, the special procedure to be followed when a person is killed by an unknown murderer and his body is found in the field, which underscores the responsibility of the community and its leaders, not only for what they do, but also for what they may have prevented from being done. If somebody is found, a corpse is found dead in the field, there is moral guilt on the community. Why? We didn't kill the guy, yes, but did we provide safety for that person? Did we provide escort? Did we provide that people could be able to travel in our country in a safe way? If we have not provide for the safety for everybody, then we have some moral responsibility. And there's a ceremony to absolve us of that moral responsibility. But really what that ceremony is saying, you're responsible. So understand, no such thing. Someone died, no one knows who he is, who cares? No, you're gonna, fascinating law. The judges of the Supreme Court have to come down to do this procedure with this unidentified corpse. No one knows who he is. He's not a prominent person, obviously. And yet, it's our problem. It's the problem of the community and the leaders of the community and the Supreme Court, right? You think about how is a society judged? They say how it protects the weakest members of the society. How is a court system judged? If the judges seem themselves responsible for even an anonymous person who was killed, no one knows who he is, unsolved murder, it's everybody's problem. Okay, so that's the parsha in a nutshell. Literally, we can speak about this parsha for a few weeks. I don't know where to start. If anyone has any comments or questions about it or something that makes you that triggered your interest, please share. Otherwise, we'll do what we always do. We'll start with the beginning and we'll see where we end up. They used to say as follows. They used to say the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, was a mystic is an understatement. And occasionally what he would do is he would get into a wagon with a few of his students and they would start driving. And where would they drive? They would go and they would, at the end of the journey, they would end up in some shtetl, and something would happen and they would meet somebody, and after being there for a while, the students of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the movement, of the Hasidic movement, would understand why they ended up over here. That's what so many stories of the Baal Shem Tov are like that. What was the key story? The key story is that the coachman of the Baal Shem Tov's horse was a Gentile. His name was Alexei, I think. And he was a coachman, he was a good guy, but he couldn't stay up. So the tale goes that he would hit the horses and he would fall asleep. And the horses would go wherever they wanted, right? So God would lead them wherever they need to go, and they would show up in a town, and then they would stop at the inn, figure out what's going on in town, who they have to help, and move on to the next step. That's the stories. So I feel like with the Baal Shem Tov's horse, we start the journey. We know where we start. We have no idea where we're going to end. So unless you have any questions to direct me. Yes?
It's interesting at the beginning when you were talking first. It's sort of like this system of checks and balances.
Yes. So Anne says that this parsha seems to be like there's a system of checks and balances. Absolutely. There's no absolute form of leadership. If you talk about monarch, we're going to talk about the monarch. The monarch that the Torah envisions is so different than the monarchs of the ancient world and up to the modern times, in the sense that the power of the monarch is limited. Even just the concept of the institution of the prophet, separate from the monarch. The prophet is the one who speaks the word of God, the voice of morality. The prophet's job, and this is what prophets did throughout history, it's a very bad job to be a prophet. Nobody wanted to be a prophet because it was dangerous business. But the job of the prophet was to go to the king and say, Mr. King, you better shape up or you're going to be destroyed. Okay? Think about any monarch that you would ever know of allowing someone to come in and say that. Impossible. In fact, what the monarch tries to do is try to say, I represent God, and whatever I do is the will of God because I'm only ruling with the power of God. That's what all monarchs said, right? And here, not only are we giving practical limitations on the voice of God, on the power of the monarch, but we're saying the voice of morality is separate than the king. The king is he's a good executive, or could be a good executive if you don't limit his power. But you don't turn to the king for voice of morality, but that you turn to the prophets. So there is a separation. Reminds me of the joke that Ronald Reagan said that once upon a time, he told, I think he told it to Gorbachev, but I may be wrong. You could find it on YouTube. But the joke is like, not a joke. The story is that that the American tells the Russian, he says, look, he says, in my country, I could walk up into the White House, and I could walk into my president's office. I could bang on the table and say, Mr. President of the United States, you're wrong, and I'll survive that. The Russian said, I could do the same thing. So the American says, you can? He says, yes, I can walk into the White House. I can walk into the President of the United States and say, Mr. President, you're wrong. Of course, he can't do it to the leader of Russia, but he can do it to the leader of the president. So the point I'm trying to say is there's no such thing as a monarch who will tolerate a separate person with the voice of morality who's here to rebuke the king. It's impossible. But in Judaism, that always stood, not only in the book, but in reality, you always had that separation. So that's just, so again, the overview is we're about to enter Israel. We're thinking about how are we going to self-rule? How are we going to rule? How are we going to organize governments? And we have various forms of leadership. Each one, I think, is limited in some ways. And once you get to the monarch is the most interesting, because the most basic question is a monarchy a good thing? Is there a commandment to appoint a king? Is not a simple matter. It's not a simple matter at all. It's up to great debate, because the commandment or the commandments regarding a king are written in such a way that it's very hard to figure out if the monarchy is a good thing or a bad thing. And it's so vague, and perhaps intentionally so. So we can get into that. We can get into that when we get there.
Did you say that the reason there are so many disagreements in the Talmud is because
there's no Sanhedrin, there's no power, there's no Sanhedrin. That's correct. In the days of the Sanhedrin, there were no disagreements. The first, let me do the math. The first probably 1,300 years of Judaism, there was no disagreements, no machlokets. Not that there was no debate, but there was a formula to solve the debates. And the formula was you go to the Supreme Court and they take a vote. Now that doesn't mean that the minority party, the dissenting view is wrong, because in the next generation, they can go back to the Supreme Court and get a new ruling based on the new majority, similar to what you have in the United States of the Supreme Court. At a certain point, the Supreme Court becomes weak. There is no strong Supreme Court, one court that everybody agrees with, and therefore you get the disagreement breaks out. Now we know the first disagreement. It's very interesting. We know the first disagreement within Judaism. It sounds very trivial and very and about ritualistic, but there was one disagreement about lismach, a very interesting thing. When you brought your offering to the temple, you would have to put your hands on the animal. That's called smicha. Today you use smicha as rabbinic ordination, because when you appoint a rabbi, Moshe puts his hands on Joshua, and Joshua puts his hands on a student. That represents that I'm passing over the torch. But when you bring your animal to the temple, you also have to put your hands on the animals, representing that the animal represents you before God. Now, the question was, do you do the smicha on the holiday? That's the first debate in Judaism, lasted for generations. And then there were two individuals, Shammai and Hillel, who you heard of, who had 3 disagreements. And then their students had hundreds of disagreements. So we know exactly at what point in history the institution of disagreements exploded. In other words, expanded. So, but yes, in a perfect world, there's no disagreement. I'm sorry, I retract. There is disagreement, but there is decision. There's a formula to resolve the law.
So how does that line up with that this is the oral Torah and it came down?
The oral Torah, in this week's parsha, we read it in the nutshell as well, but we quoted the verses that say that there's a commandment to follow the Sanhedrin. So if you look at you don't need to look at let's look at the actual verse. Here we go. Verse 8. So I'm going to read on the screen, but Corina, I'm going to take a question in a second. But okay. If you read in the book, it is page 1027, verse 8. If a matter eludes you in judgment, between blood and blood, between judgment and judgment, or between lesion and lesion, that's sarah, that's the leprosy, which one is pure, which one is impure. Words of dispute in your cities, then you shall rise and go up to the place the Lord your God chooses. We started that phrase last week's parsha. There will be a place that God will choose. And you shall come to the Levitic Kohanim and the judge who will be in those days, and you shall inquire, and they will tell you the words of judgment, and you shall do according to the word that they tell you from the place the Lord will choose, and you shall observe to do according to all they instruct you. And verse 11 is a very powerful verse. This is almost like the scriptural indication that there is an oral Torah, that the sages are supposed to rule about the cases that are not explicitly written in the Torah. According to the law they instruct you, and according to the judgment that they say to you, you shall do. You shall not divert from the word they tell you, either right or left. And if you don't listen, then there's a capital punishment. In other words, you can't. We cannot tolerate where individual people won't listen to the Supreme Court, because then you have anarchy and chaos. Go ahead, Karina.
Okay, this is not a question, it's something I want to share with you, that this phrase, like justice, justice shall you pursue, it's a very strong phrase for me, especially because in Argentina, in 1994, there was a bomb, a terrorist attack, a bomb in a community center there. And there was no justice. Nobody was charged with guilty, even though apparently we know it's from Iran and all that. And since then, every anniversary, there is like an act with people and everything. And they end that act with this sentence. Wow. Justice, justice shall you pursue. And also in some synagogues, when they finish like the services for the high holidays, they also finish the services with this phrase. It's very powerful. It's very sad because we are still like saying it, because justice, there was no justice for these people that were dead. They were killed.
Right.
So I wanted to share that. It's a very powerful phrase for me, and to read it today, it was like, wow, I have never read it like in a Torah class.
Right.
So
very powerful. I remember when it happened. I remember I was 13. I remember when that happened, 12, maybe 20. I remember when that. Yes, it's very powerful because again, it's so easy sometimes for political reasons, and for sometimes the people who are doing the injustice are more powerful, and you don't want to rock the boat. And the opening statement before, about more important than a king, more important than how we go to war. Are you going to provide justice for every person in the community? That's very powerful, because usually, I don't want to elaborate too much. Usually, the systems of court, unfortunately, serve the powerful. Even in this country, who could really make use of the law to protect their rights? The people who can afford to sue. People can afford to hire lawyers. Meanwhile, the people who are weaker or less fortunate do not have the means to protect their rights in the legal system or pursue their rights in the legal system. And that's why in this week's parsha, both the beginning and the end, the Torah is saying, justice looks like if you can provide justice for everybody, even if it's not politically beneficial. That's the beginning of the parsha. Yeah. And the end of the parsha is a very similar concept. You're tested by your ability. Could you provide justice for the person who was killed and nobody knows who? Not only no one knows who killed him, no one knows who the victim is. Right? The victim is anonymous, which means he's not an important member of society. He travels alone, right? Think about that society. Nobody traveled alone. If you're anybody, you have a few helpers traveling with you, right? If you're alone, you mean you're the outcast in the community. No one knows who you are. And here, if you're creating a justice system, justice is only justice if it protects the weakest members in society. And we have something very similar when we talk about the laws of the civil law that we get in Exodus right after the giving of the Torah. What's the first law of civil law that the Torah talks about? The first. You have to free your servant at the end of 7 years. protecting the weakest member of society. Later, we'll talk about torts and how to protect your rights if somebody damages you and what to do. That's for most of the society. That comes secondary. Where are you tested? Could you protect the weakest member of society? And that's the test of justice. And unfortunately, we have a way to go to fulfill the verse tzedek tzedek tirdof. And I think it's right. But I think, like I said, I read certainly, I don't know if it's true, but I certainly read that, like I said, Justice Ginsburg had this verse on her desk because it's something that you have to constantly strive to do. So it's not just pursue justice. It's justice shall you pursue. And pursue in Hebrew, tirdof, is a very powerful word. It's more than, like in English, pursue represents that it takes effort. It's not always easy. And sometimes it takes investment, but you have to pursue it. Go ahead, Richard.
Just want to mention, what you're just speaking about now, justice. This correlates to a discourse you gave a few weeks ago when you were talking about retribution and things of that nature. If a person cannot afford a lawyer, a poor person, and justice is not properly given to this poor person, what recourse does this poor person have? Can they take out seeking justice on their own? Did they leave it up to Hashem to?
That's a good point. In some instances, a person's allowed to take the law into their own hands. In limited instances, I don't want to go into that. That would be a discussion for itself. But I would say that the court system is designed to protect everybody. There were no lawyers allowed in the old system. Didn't take a lot of time. There was the delay in justice. Today, you try to get a hearing. A lawsuit will take you a few years. Well, who can afford to wait that long? The more powerful, the more wealthy. If I'm poor, I can't afford the time to litigate, right? So in Hebrew, there's something called inui din. Perversion of justice is delayed. In America, they say too, justice delayed is justice avoided or perverted, whatever, I forget the phrase. Do you delay justice? If it takes time, you're already harming the weaker party because the wealthier party can afford the time, right? So there was a process of it was understood that the court things can't take a long time. And you have to do it quickly. And again, you can never get a perfect system of justice. And therefore, there's always going to be people who sort of crimes that fall between the cracks and you can't prove it. Again, it's very hard to prove crimes under the Jewish system of law. But I think the concept, justice that you pursue means you always have to understand that as a society, that's our most important obligation. Before we think about the power of the government, of the king, justice is the foundation of this parsha. And it's an ongoing effort to try to pursue justice. Okay. Okay, I want to talk about a few things about the beginning of the parsha, but first we're going to share the screen and look at the beginning of the parsha. So if you have the Stone edition, I'm looking at page 1025, verse 18. So I'm going to read the first three verses. I'm going to read the first five verses. Why not? And again, for Karina, here you'll see it in the Chumash, you'll see it in the actual Torah. Here the words, verse 20, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, or tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. Here we go. You shall set up, so I'm reading chapter 16, verse 18. In the Stone, it's page 1025, top of the page. On the screen, it's the first verse that you see here. Beginning of the parsha. You shall set up judges and law enforcement officials for yourself in all your cities that the Lord your God is giving you, for your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. Very interesting. You have to have a local court. The court has to be in every city, and the court has to be of every tribe. In other words, it's similar to the concept of being judged by your peers. It's not like some other tribe. The judge comes from a different tribe, right? You have that in some societies who are very tribal, and you have one tribe that is in the position of leadership, and they're judging everybody. It doesn't always work. Like in the Middle East, you have some countries where the minority tribe is in charge of the power. Here, you're judged really by people of your city, and there has to be a judge of your tribe in the days where things were very tribal before there was a king. But we'll get to that later. Next verse. Verse 20, verse 19, you shall not pervert justice, you shall not show favoritism, and you shall not take a bribe. For bribery blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts just words. Very powerful words. I don't want to get to bribery right now because we'll say that for another time. Verse 20, justice shall you pursue, that you may live and possess the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now, here comes a strange verse. You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah. Asherah was a tree that was associated with an idol. In other words, people would serve the tree, or any tree near the altar of the Lord your God, which you shall make for yourself, and you shall not set up for yourself a monument which the Lord your God hates. Okay, what is an Asherah? By the way, it's very practical. Every idol, every self-respecting idol had a tree called an Asherah next to the idol. How come? To understand, you have to think about the Middle East or think about the August Day. It's hot in the Middle East. People want shade. So if you're in the idol business, you want people to congregate around your idol. So what do? You build an idol, you build a tree, and they would plant the tree for the purpose of idol worship. And that became sort of a holy tree, but it served also a practical benefit where people would find shade next to the idol. So what does the Torah say? The Torah says we have to be different. Next to the altar, there's no next to the right verse 21. You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah or any tree near the altar of the Lord. God, the God in the temple, in the Jewish temple, you see the pictures, the renderings of the temple in Jerusalem. There's not a tree on the Temple Mountain. How come? How come we don't like shade? It was a building. Why are there no trees? The answer is this verse. You're not allowed to plant a tree next to on the temple. Why? Because the idol worshippers did it. That's a simple interpretation. But now we're going to go deeper. We'll get to philosophical discussion, and this is where things get exciting. But even on the simple level, it's very interesting that also the next verse, you shall not set up for yourself a monument. Matseva is a monument. A monument is an altar, but it's one stone, as opposed to the altar, which is a combination of stones. God says, altar, good, monument, God hates, which is a big problem because the patriarchs built monuments to God. They built a matzeva, they built a stone to represent this is the place where you serve God. So Rashi addresses this, and Rashi says, yes, in the days of the patriarchs, God loved the monuments, but now God hates the monuments. Very few things in the Torah does it say God hates. This is an example. Verse 22, you shall not set up for yourself a monument which the Lord your God hates. The very powerful word, Saneh, a very strong word. God hates. How many things does God hate? He hates monuments. So Rashi says, let's open Rashi. Again, I'm giving you the first practical interpretation, then we go to the more philosophical interpretation. Says Rashi, which the Lord your God hates. God has commanded you to make an altar of stones and an altar of earth. This, however, he hates because this was a religious status of the Canaanites. And although it was dear to him in the days of the patriarchs, now he hates it since these people made it a statute for idolatry, CC free. In other words, according to Rashi, what's the difference between a monument and an altar? An altar of many stones or altar of one stone. Who cares? Many stones, one stone. What's the difference? So Rashi says, look, it's not about the stones. It's about we're trying to separate ourselves from the idol worshippers. So since the Canaanites began to make monuments to God, so we stop. And similar, it's the tree. Since they put trees next to the idols, we're not going to put any trees next to our place of worship. That is the simple meaning. But now there are layers upon layers upon layers. I'm going to talk about these two layers, and here it gets interesting in my opinion. First thing the Torah says as follows. Let's see if Rashi says it. No, Rashi doesn't say it. We're talking about judges. How do you end up with the altar of God? Don't plant a tree next to the altar. We're talking about judges. What's it got to do with the temple? What's it got to do with idol worship? So there's a very interesting concept, and that is that the Supreme Court sat in the temple. There was a chamber in the temple in Jerusalem, Temple Mountain. There was a chamber where the Supreme Court sat. So That's why also every time the Torah mentions Supreme Court, the Torah mentions altar, also in the book of Exodus. Because it says Elam Mishpatim, these are the statutes which you should put before them. These are the judgments that you should put before them. Verse right before that talks about the laws of the altar. So this teaches us that you place the Supreme Court in the temple next to the altar. So in some sense, when it says don't put any trees next to the altar, it's also saying don't put any trees next to the judge. It's next to the Supreme Court. It's also saying the antithesis. Okay, so that's point one. That's just practically, that's what the sages explain. Now I'm going to try to go a little deeper. We say as follows, we're talking about judges. How do you enter, why are we discussing idol worship? And you're going to see later that the Torah gets right back to idol worship. If you continue down these verses, I'm going to close the Rashis here so you can see the flow. Hide the Rashi. If you continue down to verse 2, on this same page, Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 2, still on page 1025 in the ArtScroll. You're going to have a whole portion from verse 2 all the way to verse 7 is the laws of somebody who serves idols and it's capital punishment. And we also learn laws, the laws of witnesses, where you have to investigate and there has to be witnesses, etc. But we go right away into the laws of idol worship. Why idol worship? So there's 2 points here. One point, go ahead. There's a few points here. One point here is, remember I told you in the beginning that we're trying to put a limitation on the power of the judge. So what's the example that we're going to say? Even the worst crime in the Torah. What's the worst crime in the Torah? In some sense, idol worship is the worst crime in the Torah, because we will see later that idol worship is the source of all immorality. We'll get to that in a minute, right? The Torah, 10 Commandments, 2 of the first 10 Commandments is against idol worship. Believe in the one God, don't serve idols. There are many commandments to eradicate idol worship from our land. Idol worship is the worst crime. And that's why we say judges. There'll be a case of idol worship. Even in idol worship, I don't care if it's a terrible crime, you must have 2 witnesses. Go to verse 6. By the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall the one liable be put to death. He shall not be put to death by the mouth of 1 witness. Sometimes there's a terrible crime. There's a pressure to find someone guilty. You have this all the time. If there's a crime, the police, unfortunately, sometimes because they have to charge someone, so they not always apply all the laws of all the precautions necessary. Here we're saying the limitation on the power of the judge is so powerful that even when it comes to the most important crime, in some ways, the most important crime in the Torah, the crime of idol worship, even then you must follow the protocols of justice. And again, most important one is you need 2 witnesses. You can't say I have a hunch. You can't say someone told me. You can't say hearsay. You need 2 witnesses and you have to investigate it. But the point is we're bringing idol worship because we want to say even in the worst crime, you have to be very careful. That's one interpretation. That's the legal interpretation. But now we're going to get to the moral and ethical interpretation in a moment. But first, Vicky, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question about the wording. Can you hear me?
Yes.
In the wording on verse 21, erect for yourselves the pillar that God hates. Does that imply that it's something that you do the same as the Tower of Babel? We already know that Hashem hates being selfish and not caring about other people. And comparing to the altar, because altar serves something and pillar is just for yourself.
Right, interesting. You're saying lecha means it's self-serving. That's very interesting. Never thought about it.
I was just wondering about if the wording, if translation is correct.
Yeah, you shall not set up lecha for yourself. Yes, don't set up for yourself. If you notice, you'll have that in verse 21 as well, and in verse 22. You shall not plant for yourself an Asherah, and verse 22, and you shall not set up for yourself a monument. Lecha. Don't make it for yourself. Very interesting. Never noticed that.
And that may be the source of the worst form of idolatry, when people worship themselves.
Right. So I'm going to elaborate upon that a little bit and say, okay, so good point. Hang on to that thought and see if you want to adjust it based on what I'm going to say. Okay, so what are we saying here? We're talking, so that's the first, the legal interpretation is very simple. We want to say, why are we mentioning idol worship? Because we want to bring an example of the worst crime, and yet the procedures of justice still must be kept. You can't say, the crime is so terrible, let's kill out the whole town. No. Worst crime, you still have to protect the rights of the accused. You have to, very powerful verses, and they're all, verse 4, for example, on page 1020, 1027, 1025, I'm sorry, 1020, the bottom of 1025, verse 4, and it will be told to you. You hear about the crime, right? And you will hear it and investigate it thoroughly. And behold, the matter coincides, the abomination has been perpetuated in Israel. But the verses, will be told to you, you will hear it, you have to investigate it thoroughly. And all these words, you will hear it, investigate it thoroughly, teaches us laws in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, teaches us the process, the due process that you have to give to the person accused of crime. And the greatest protection, like I said, is the two witnesses. So we start with the worst crime. Even in the worst crime, you need to protect the procedures of justice. That is the practical legal interpretation of why we talk about idol worship, because, like I said, the point we made. Now we're going to go a little bit deeper, a little bit more philosophical, but go ahead.
I think that,
Go ahead, go ahead.
backtracking just a bit, but the notes on 21, 22, last part, the Torah places the emphasis on what takes place inside the courts and synagogues, not only the beauty of the exterior.
Right, very good, very good. We want to make sure, don't put up fancy trees. When you come to serve God, you're coming because it's a spiritual experience. If the building is too fancy, then he would say, I'm going to show why. Oh, the architecture is wonderful. That's not a reason to go to the show, right? So you want to focus on what's internal and not external. Interesting, very good. Okay, one more point. By the way, if you like the architecture, you can still come to show, I think. It's just, that's not the main reason. Okay, next point. Oh, the antithesis, why are we talking about the prohibition of idol worship in the context of justice? Because I'm going to give two reasons that I think are both interesting. And these are two reasons I never said in the past, so I'm excited that we could say something new here. Number one is the antithesis to justice and judgment is idol worship. If you're going to talk about a judge, the opposite, the worst crime, in other words, the antithesis, the attack on the institution of justice is idol worship. How so? So there are many interpretations. I'll give you one. Most important thing is that the premise of the judgment or justice or the court system, the judicial system, the basic premise is that people have responsibility. They're responsible for their actions. You killed somebody, society is going to hold you accountable. You damaged somebody, society is going to make you pay. You are responsible. And the institution of justice is holding people accountable for their actions. In the mind frame of idol worship, it doesn't work. The whole idea of idol worship, I will talk about it later today if we're not going to have time. If we have time, the whole idea of idol worship is to say that the person has no power. The person is passive. Who's powerful? The forces of nature. That's why you have to serve the forces of nature. And that's why you have to serve every last force of nature, because you cannot achieve anything without the forces of nature agreeing to it. And that's why wherever there was idol worship, there was no morality, because there's no personal responsibility. And therefore, if I did something wrong, it's because the gods either forced me to do it or allowed me to do it or want me to do it. So the antithesis to justice, to the institution of justice, is idol worship, because idol worship idol worship is the proclamation that I don't have any power. I'm subject to the forces of nature, and that is going to reappear later in the portion many times. Maybe I'll address it in a moment after Richard's question. Well, that's one point. I'm going to say one more point, and that's to Vicky's point. Why are we talking about idol worship so much? So one point that may be the case is because we're talking about institutions of power: the judge, the prophet, the court, the priest, the king. What do we have to say? Be careful about idol worship. Understand that the only ultimate powerful power is God. Don't make your king into the idol. Don't make your judge into the idol. Often what happens is either because the king, the dictator, wants it, or because the people have a psychological need. But people tend to worship. If you look at history, people tend to worship and idealize their leader. It happens all throughout history, right? And because we have a symbol of our power and we want to be subject to somebody. So what God is saying right in the beginning, here's a parsha. You need to self-rule. You need to govern. You can't have anarchy. You need leadership. So here is the judge, here is the prophet, here is the priest, here is the king. But understand that the importance of idol worship, ultimately realizing that the person in power is God, power is not human, and let the human being not make themselves a God. So that reminder comes right in the beginning of this parsha. So here's the power, but the power has the potential to corrupt, and corrupt is that the powerful presents himself as a God. So right in the beginning, we're going to introduce these institutions of power. We have to say, you're very powerful, you're a king, you have certain authority, you're a judge, you have certain authority, but you're not an idol, you're not God. There's only one God. And that's why we insert it right here in the beginning, according to some interpretations. Go ahead, Richard.
Yes, in relation to what you just said, people should not ascribe to results in their life based on nature or, things of this particular venue. But there's the saying too, that if God wants something to happen, it'll happen. If he doesn't want it to happen, it will not happen. So you can make all the efforts that you want to achieve a desired result. But if God does not want that to happen, or if he does want it to happen, it's going to happen either way. If he doesn't want it to happen, it will not happen. If he wants it to happen, it will happen. So you make the effort. But when you said before, people ascribe to nature or Mother Nature, whatever you want to call it, as intervening to why a situation happened. Yes, you're ascribing to an idol, so to speak. But God has the ultimate control. So you should not get frustrated if you're trying to make an effort for a particular result for a business deal and it doesn't happen. People say, well, maybe God did not want me to have that particular deal. Is that a proper way to look at this?
Yes, but I just clarify, because again, it's a very important topic and a general topic, but I don't want to spend too much time in it. So I'll give you a formula. The formula is, when I was a kid, my mother told me, she didn't tell me, but some people's mothers told them, you can be whatever you want to be. And I hate to burst the bubble, but it's not true. Like if I want to play in the NFL tomorrow morning, I can't do it. I don't care how. I can't be an Olympic. I don't know. I can't get into any sport in the Olympics. In other words, certain things you can't do. Certain things, if it's not your nature, you don't have the ability to do it. So it's not true that you can do anything you want. It's not just simply not true. I want to be as smart as Einstein. Okay, good. So I'm very happy that you want to do it. Doesn't mean you could, right? You have certain gifts. I want to be an artist. I could develop it, but I'm not going to be the best artist in the world. Some things I'm born with a gift, and some people, I don't have the gift for that. I have the gift for something else. So it's not true that you can do anything you want. What is true is that you have absolute moral choice. When it comes to a moral choice, the question of that's internal. The question is, am I going to choose A or B? And forget about the result. Richard, you're focusing on the result. Will I be able to succeed in this business and make $1 million? That's the result. I don't know about the result. You need God's siyata d'shmaya, you need God's help. But my own moral choice. I have the responsibility. If I pull the trigger, if I harm somebody, it's not because I had no choice to control my instincts. I have complete control of my own moral choices. And that's the formula. We can elaborate upon for a long time. So I don't want to go too far into this because we have 8 minutes left. I'm going to say something I said in the past, but you'll forgive me. But it's very much related to what we're about to say. And if we have extra time, I don't think we'll see what we can do if we have extra time. Later on in this parasha, we read about the astrologers. And the Torah says, don't get involved in astrology. And why not? It's always good to know what's going to happen in the future. It's actually get an edge. Imagine you know when the stock market will go up or down. I knew when the stock market, if I knew the timing of the stock market, I would be able to make a few dollars. But so you have an edge. If you have an edge, if you could know the future. The Torah says, don't be worried about the future. Why not? Says God, you don't need to. Why not? You don't need a sorcerer. You have a prophet. You have a prophet to tell you what to do. Okay, so what's that? What's the difference? What's the difference where you get your news? Sorcerer or the prophet, who cares? What's the difference? Why is a sorcerer so bad and the prophet so good? So let's read the verses. So I'm looking at verse 9 in chapter 18. Chapter 18, verse 9. On this page, it would be, in this book, it would be,
Page 1033.
yeah, page 1031. It's important. It's 1033. Yeah. 1033, top of the page. Verse 9. When you have come to the land that the Lord your God has given you, you shall not learn to do like the abominations of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who passes his son or daughter through fire, a soothsayer, a diviner of auspicious times, one who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or a charmer, a pitom sorcerer, or a Yidoni's sorcerer, or a necromancer. I have no idea what the various distinctions between all these forms of sorcery, but it was a very developed business back then. You go to somebody, he tells you what's a good time to invest, what's a bad time to invest, what's going to happen. It's a terrible thing. For whoever does these things is an abomination. Terrible, terrible. Turn the page. No, in this book, it's in the same page, but turn the page on the screen. You're going to get to, you don't need that, verse 14. For these nations which you are to possess, hearken to diviners of auspicious times and soothsayers. But as for you, the Lord your God has not given you things like these. A prophet from among you, from your brothers like me, the Lord your God will set up for you. You shall hearken to him. Okay, we don't need sorcerers. Sorcerers are abomination. What do? We go to the prophet. Now I ask you, what's the difference? If a diviner who tells you what's going to happen in the future, should I go to war? Yes or no? That was King Saul. The night before he died, he went to the witch, and she said, "Should I go to war?" And she told him she got Samuel. She spoke to the dead. They got Samuel, and Samuel said, "You're going to die." Okay, good to know. The point here is he wanted to know the future. So the prophet. So that's an abomination. But God says you don't. That's an abomination. But for you, you go to the prophet. Prophet is also in the business of telling you the future. Why is it so bad? Why is the sorcerer so bad? Why is the prophet so good? So there are different interpretations. I'm going to say one that I like. I said it in the past. I'll say it again because I like it so much. It's not just the difference of who tells you the news. Is it the representative of the idol? That's what the sorcerers were, or the representative of God? It's not that. It is a completely different message that the sorcerer tells you and the prophet tells you. A completely different message. The sorcerer tells you this is the future, and you cannot change the future because nature is too powerful, circumstances are too powerful, astrology is too powerful. You have no power to overcome your own shortcomings. The sorcerer tells you this is the future, and there's no way to change it. What is the prophet telling you? The exact opposite. The prophet says this is the future unless you shape up. Think about every prophet. Jonah. God sends Jonah to Nineveh, and he says, tell them in 40 days the city's going to turn over. Okay. What's the job of the prophet? To give news? No. The job of the prophet is to inspire change. The sorcerer never inspires change. His message is the opposite. His message is no matter what you do, you are trapped under the forces of nature. So you better pay me, and I'll tell you when's a good time, whenever you will achieve. You will achieve. And this is a bad time. No matter what you do, this is a bad time. Don't try to do anything, and don't try to accomplish anything. Because the philosophical underpinnings of sorcery is that nature is all powerful, and you have to find at times when you can get what you need. You can get it done because you can't go up against nature. Nature, I mean the nature in the world, but also your own personal nature. Right? Your own shortcomings, you can't overcome yourself. And the prophet is saying, no. The prophet is saying, this is the future if you don't change it. But the prophet's call is, please prove me wrong. That's what the prophet is saying. When Jonah goes to the city of Nineveh, we all know the story of Jonah. Read it on Yom Kippur. Jonah doesn't want to go. Why doesn't he want to go? Because he says, you know what's going to happen? God tells me, go to Nineveh and tell them in 40 days the city will be destroyed. Jonah says, I don't want to go. So when we were kids, we were thought that Jonah doesn't want to go because the people are not going to believe him. Right? Like I said, I once stood in Manhattan. I was once in Manhattan, on 34th Street, and the guy said, in 40 days, Manhattan's going to be turned over. Did I go home and do teshuva? No, I should have. But I didn't believe him. So when we were kids, we thought, they told us that Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh because no one would believe him. And that's why he got onto the boat. He went to Tarshish. Okay. But that's not true. If you read the story, he was afraid that people are going to believe him. And when they believe him, he was afraid that the people are going to repent. And he tells God, why would I go tell them that the city will be destroyed? I know you're a compassionate God. You're going to change your mind. I don't want to work for a compassionate God. Imagine God hires you. Tell everybody the city's going to be destroyed. You're like, dude, you're not going to destroy the city. You're too kind. The people are going to repent. You're going to accept the repentance. I'm going to be a mockery. Everyone's going to see that what I said is not going to happen. In other words, Jonah was afraid that the people will listen to him, take him serious, change, and then his prediction will fail. And you know what God says? Well, that's your job. Your job is not to predict the future. That's not the job of the prophet. That's the job of the sorcerer. The job of the prophet is to get people to change. So now, why should this ties back? The prophet, the idol worship says, this is what you are, you can change, and therefore you're going to have to serve the idols and hope that they give you grace. And what the concept of the prophet and really the concept of justice, and we said this is the critical point of justice. The critical point of justice is personal responsibility. You have the ability to decide what you're going to do, and therefore, if you do something wrong, you're subject to be held accountable by the people, by the courts, because there's no justice system without personal responsibility. And there's no personal responsibility where there is an Asherah, an idol tree. Now we understand why the Torah must address idol worship throughout this entire parsha when it's talking about justice, because the concept, the belief in idol worship is the opposite of personal responsibility, which is antithesis, and therefore there cannot be the notion of justice. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a story in short. There's so much more to say. Come back, God willing, in good health in 1 year from now, and we'll continue.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
You
Thanks,
too.
Rabbi. Rabbi, you know the old joke, don't you?